Hey everybody, my name is Tim and welcome to Vellum Fundamentals. So in this series we're going to be talking all about Vellum, what is Vellum, and essentially everything you can do with Vellum, from soft bodies, cloth, fluids, grains, all of that type of stuff. And I really want to get sort of into the nitty gritty and explain sort of a lot of the underlying stuff, because that's what I noticed in trying to explain stuff to people about Vellum, and questions that I saw online is that a lot of people know how to use these top level tools, but they don't understand sort of this lower level to how all of this works. So what I'm going to be trying to do is similar to how I do with a lot of my other courses, like building custom solvers in Houdini or Houdini 101. I'm going to try to break it down to a lower level, so you kind of understand kind of how it works, and that's going to be easier to sort of work your way through Vellum. So with this video series and possibly going forward with other stuff, I'm going to do it a little bit different. So normally with a lot of my courses, I sort of pre-prepare the entire course and then I put it on Patreon and on Gumroad once it's done, so you can watch it in its entirety. Then I put videos on YouTube every week. And it's been a little bit difficult to keep doing that. The thing is, like, I have a lot of ideas of stuff that I want to do. It's just that beforehand to sort of pre-prepare this entire thing takes a lot of work. And also I kind of lack the community feedback in between sort of recording these things. Because like if there's going to be questions, I just need to answer them on Discord individually or in YouTube comments individually. So what I'm going to try to do with this video series about Vellum, and possibly about with other stuff that I'm doing in the future, I'm going to record one video every week. Starting this week with a sort of introduction to Vellum. And then next week, we're going to do another video and we're going to introduce some of the questions that I got. And I already got a question on another video with a Vellum booty shake that I've done before. I don't know if you've seen it, but there was a question there about maybe possibly redoing it, a newer version. So that's probably something I'm going to try to tackle in this series as well. So the idea is that I'm just going to be recording one video every week. And I'm going to try to sort of take your questions and comments into the next video. Of course, there's still going to be a topic for every video, so I might not be able to cover every question in every video, but I'll keep a list of all of the questions that I'll be getting, so then I can put them in future videos. So yeah, this week we're going to talk about the fundamentals of Vellum. So I have a little PowerPoint that I've prepared just with some stuff about Vellum. We're going to dive into Vellum itself, just show you the basic overview if you don't even know what Vellum is. And then we're gonna sort of dive deeper into like, how does Vellum work? Like how does the solver work? The sort of specifics that you need to know about the solver. How do you set up these constraints inside of Houdini, the different constraint types, etc., etc. So that's going to be this video. We're not going to be making anything particularly interesting. It's going to be more about sort of the low level stuff and just explaining how it works. In next week's video, we're going to cover a different topic and we're going to go into that. I think for next week, I'm going to do everything around soft bodies. So if you have questions regarding that or something else, just leave a comment and I'll try to cover it in next week's video. But for now, let's just dive into sort of the fundamentals of Vellum and sort of discover how it works. All right, so we're here inside of Houdini, and because I don't know how familiar you are with Houdini, one important thing in Houdini is that you want to be able to see the attributes, because attributes are a big thing. You've probably played around with them a little bit. So let's make a geometry node, and let's make a sphere. Just something simple. So just make a geometry node, and then go in there, press tab, and then make a sphere. Or you can go in here and just press tab and then create a sphere like that. Or you can go here to create and then control and then click on the sphere and it will also create it. But in Houdini, we want to be able to see our attributes. This is something that I really go into in Houdini 101, one of my introductory courses to Houdini. So if you're really new to Houdini, I probably recommend starting there instead. The playlist is on my channel. But we want to be able to see attributes to anything that we do. And right now we cannot do that. We need to go in here to geometry spreadsheet and we can see the data. But what I like to do is I like to change my UI a little bit so I have a little bit easier access to this stuff, because I really like to be able to look at my data at all times. So the way you can do that is go to this thing here, go split top bottom. This will split the view. You can see we get an extra viewport. You can right click on here, inspectors, and then geometry spreadsheet. And now we can get a sort of a pane here to look at our data a little bit easier. And then what I also like to do generally is to split these ones left and right, split these ones left and right, and then press and hold the pin icon, pin this one to 1, and then press this one, pin this one to 2. And we can actually jump in and out of a node, like when we have two sort of different work areas. I'm going to close the right one for now, so you can just close it by clicking that button, and you can pop it back out like that. But just so you know that's how it works, and you can save it out, current desktop, give it a name, and you can set it as a startup interface by, you can see here, build or whatever. So you can click a custom one, click accept, and it will always start up Houdini using that UI. Right, so yeah, the sphere has some information here. It has position information. So let's say we want to do a vellum simulation. Now, if you press tab here and you type vellum, you can see a whole bunch of stuff going on here. Vellum constraints is sort of the general way to set up, like allows you to set different constraints here. We're going to go into what these different types of constraints are in a little bit. But if you want to just do a basic thing, there's a whole bunch of presets you can use. So you can actually type vellum and then, for example, balloon. You can get a preset for balloon. If you hover over it, press Shift Enter, you can see it will automatically attach it to your sphere. There's also other ways you can do stuff like this. There's also a shelf tool for vellum. And I know that this might not work because I have some issues with my shelf tool sometimes. But if I go to vellum and then I, for example, go Control click vellum balloon, and then right, you can see it will set up the constraint setup as well, with a null going for geo and a null with constraints. So kind of similar to set it up. I generally just use the tab menu here, but you can use whatever you want. Right, so this sets up two different of these constraints, constraint subs that we used before. Actually, these are all of these nodes in Houdini are actually sort of pre-packaged things made up of other nodes. If you double click on it, you can actually dive into this. If you want to like go really in depth on like a lot of the stuff, you can actually go into there and have a look at how this all works, how this is built. And then you might already start to see like how you can also build your own custom stuff here. Yeah, this is how you just set up something like this. And now if we're going to press play with the top arrow icon on our keyboard, nothing is really happening because we haven't attached a solver yet. So if you attach a vellum solver, you press it, you put the geometry in the first input, constraints in second input. And if I now press play, this is gonna fall down because yeah, there's gravity on this. You can see in forces, you can see gravity put to that. And then in the third input, we can actually put something like a collider. For example, we could make a grid, move it down, and we can press play, and then it's gonna. Oh, by the way, you might notice here something in our viewport here. This is actually a bug. Like you're gonna run into this at some point. Sometimes Houdini has a viewport bug, so geometry will stick in the viewport even though it's no longer there. If you just close your view like that, and then go to new pane, viewers, make a new viewer, you can see the problem is gone. Interesting that we run into this already. But yeah, there you go. So yeah, press forward and you can see it's sort of falling down. And then we have options on here to, for example, increase our, like inflate our balloon. This is the basic way to set up stuff for a vellum simulation. You've probably already done this, but beyond this, you might not understand what is going on. Let's try another one. Let's try a soft body, because this is what a lot of people just start to do when they start to do Houdini. Like you might do a strut soft body, and then again, this is gonna put this down, and we do vellum solver. Oh, So you connect everything up and then you put your grid and then you press play. And it's gonna fall down, being a soft body and all. And then you have these values that you can play with. You've probably done all this. Now I want to take a step back and kind of, how does this work? Like what are these things that we're plugging into solver? What does the solver do? How does all of this work? It's like you've probably done this. But before we get into like any further into this, I really just want to sort of just explore what's going on. So here we have geometry. We have these lines here. Like, what are these lines? What is going on? What does this solver do? Like, there's stuff you can go in here. And actually, if you make it editable, you might notice this is actually just a wrapped top network and stuff going on. There's a lot going on. Let me go back a step, open up my PowerPoint, and kind of explain what Vellum solver is. All right, so now we're in a PowerPoint. I did a previous recording where I actually started with the PowerPoint. I figured it would make more sense to beginners to just see something dropping and just how you put it down before we start getting a little bit more technical. But Vellum is a XPBD multi-solver. So essentially what it does, it does essentially everything that you want a solver to do. It's not very specialized, so it doesn't do all of these things the best way, but it can do all of these things. For example, it does fluids, but it has, like, there's specific types of fluids that it's good at. It's good at small scale fluids or having fluids interact with other stuff. Like, it does soft body dynamics, but if you want to do really accurate soft bodies, there's a different solver for that called FEM solver, which realistically you will probably just use Vellum. But if you're going to do really high-end productions, you might use the FEM solver. But so it's essentially, it's a multi-solver that can do all types of different things. So cloth, you can like put clothes on your character, have it walk around, or just make curtains or make a flag, make whatever. There's anything cloth. Soft body dynamics, so like a bouncing ball or something like that. A balloon would also, is kind of a little bit in between. It's not really a soft body, but it's kind of like in between cloth and the soft body. Grains, so making sand, mud, stuff like that. Rigid bodies is kind of like soft body dynamics, but in Houdini 19 they introduced sort of a new constraint type, which allows something to remain much stiffer. We'll get into sort of how that works and why it might be useful. Fluids, so we'll get into all of these things in the coming weeks. We're gonna do one video every week covering different things. But yeah, so PBD, so Vellum is a PBD solver. So XPBD solver stands for position-based dynamics, and position-based dynamics is essentially the solver sort of keeps track of the positions of all of these points on your geometry, and it sort of creates constraints in between. It sort of keep these points together. And all of these lines here, they have a specific length. And essentially, so if this point is connected to that point by a line, and then this line has a specific like stretchiness, so it can stretch or it can contract. And so there's data on these on these lines that say, all right, how much can one point move from another before it sort of gets reeled back a little bit. That's kind of what a PBD solver is. So these points also have a radius. So if you're just using it for grains, the solver is going to make sure that, right, if these points get really close together, they cannot go into one another because they have a certain radius, and the solver is going to make sure that this stuff will collide. And Vellum is XPBD. It's a better version of PBD that doesn't change as much with substeps. So this is getting a little bit technical, but I've prepared an example for this in Houdini. So PBD has been around for a long time. If you ever use RealFlow before, it had a PBD solver, which was great for like small scale fluids and stuff like that, but it's really slow. Now XPBD is sort of an improvement on that. So position, like a regular PBD solver would often like really change the look depending on the substeps that you're going to give. What substep is like if you run a simulation, like you have frames, right? And you have frames in between those frames. There are steps the solver can do in between those frames. And a regular PBD solver would sort of like the look would really change in between in between simulations, which is not necessarily the case. It's a little bit the case with XPBD, but not as much. So now let's head back into Houdini, so we can explore sort of these things with these points, explore this thing with sort of the sub-steps and like the difference that it would make in just a regular PBD solver. I have an example with Bullet prepared for that actually. But it's probably interesting to sort of understand how this sort of works before we dive deeper into Vellum, and also to understand how these constraints work and just the type of data that sort of lives on these constraints. So let's head back into Houdini and we can have a look at these things. So here we're back inside of Houdini, and let's go into a rigid body sim. And actually, because let's just have a look at this thing here on the first input. Right, so if you're gonna look at this, you might not think this is a rigid body sim. Like it looks like a soft body, like a Vellum sim stuff. Like a thing is just playing around. Let's put maybe this sweep to a round tube. Might look a little bit nicer. But yeah, you can see this moving around. But this actually is a rigid body sim, and the way the reason why I'm showing it like this is because here with so how you did sort of these more like a tube or like metal bending or stuff like that before Vellum, you would actually use rigid bodies for this. And I think it's a good example to sort of show you kind of in a simple way the sort of this concept with these points being constrained by lines. Because that's a concept that's gonna come back in different solvers in Houdini anyway. And also, it's just an interesting example if you didn't know about using rigid bodies for stuff like this. Then now you do. So what I set up here is just, I have a line. This line has a bunch of points on it, and I have a cube here. I copy cube to it. I assemble this, so I get packed geometry. You can see a whole bunch of packed boxes. If you didn't know what packed is, it means that it's treated as a point, and it's going to reference an object on disk. So if I pack an instance it on here, essentially it's like every point is gonna say, all right, reference this original box here, and then just put the position and the rotation on wherever the point on this curve is. So that's what a packed piece of geometry is. This just Bullet deals better with packed. This is kind of the reason I know we're getting off track here. But what I'm doing here is connect adjacent pieces. And you can see here, we're creating lines in between our pieces. So you can already kind of see why I'm doing it like this, because this is going to be very similar to like if we have a Vellum simulation. You can also see there's going to be these lines, right? So already a similarity there. And so these lines have a length, but we don't know the length. So we can measure the length of these things. So you can perimeter length. And you can see we're getting an attribute on this called rest length. And that's going to be the length of each of these individual pieces here. Right down here, I'm just setting up some constraint names, just a constraint name and a strength. And then here in the solver, we're just reading in here. Like you don't have to repeat this after me. This is just to prove a point. We're just sort of setting up rigid body solver, loading in the constraints, setting it as hard constraints. And then this is going to look like this. So it's going to fall down. And because these things are constrained together, like they're going to behave a little bit weird because they're boxes. Like if you would make this spheres, it would probably behave a little bit more clearly, but that would not illustrate the point that I'm going to be making a little bit. But yeah, if we go in here and we just press play, you can see it falling down. And the thing here is that if we increase the sub-steps on this solver, it's actually going to be more stiff. You can see now we're actually going to get a little bit more of a metal. Let's make it 500. It's going to be even worse. You can see it keeps getting stiffer. So the sort of the behavior of this solver is really gonna change a lot depending on like how many constraints we have with this thing. So yeah, it's kind of the thing that I mentioned here with this PBD versus XPBD. Just a small thing. Like you don't necessarily need to remember this. It's just a thing that I thought would be interesting to put in this sort of Vellum fundamentals. But yeah, with this rigid body thing out of the way, let's actually go into some examples of just the different types of constraints that there are, and also why I showed it sort of with this line and the measuring, because that's essentially what Vellum is also doing. So the simplest example that you can have is a cloth. Probably that's the most basic type of a Vellum simulation that you could have. So if I press play here, you can see it's not necessarily, I've already changed some settings on this. It's quite of a stiff cloth here. Let me reduce the bend stiffness here a little bit. Right. You can see we just have a piece of cloth falling down and just looking like a piece of low body cloth. Reason why I'm taking here sort of a piece of cloth as a first example. Like if you're here, you have cloth. Here you have I think this is set up for a balloon, soft bodies, and some other stuff. You can see all of these have multiple constraints put together, except for cloth. Cloth is just one constraint type. And you can see if we go in here, there's a preset here set for cloth. You can see there's multiple different types that you can set up, and cloth is a distance along edges. Essentially, what it does, let's make a null here, so we can actually have a look at the different outputs that this thing gives. So let's call this one geo. So that's also what the shelf tool does, right? And I'll call this one con. So one part here is the constraints and one is the geometry. So this is the geometry. You see there's not really that much going on here. We have some information stored on the points of this geometry. So you can see the drag on the normals, the mass, so how much does it weigh, the p-scale. Again, this is sort of the radius around every point that we have here, because again, like the points cannot sort of go through each other, and a bunch of other stuff. And then we have the constraints here, which has nothing on the points here, but they do have it on the primitives, because like every primitive here, so every like of these lines, you can see here goes like this, has a couple of points, of course, but it's just storing sort of the information on this entire primitive. And you can see there's this rest length again, which is kind of what we had before, right? With the body simulation, where we put a measure and then perimeter, which you can see sort of calculates the rest length. Let's see, it's called perimeter now. We can see the length of these things measures up. So it's essentially, that's probably what this thing is also doing. So if we search in here, you can see measure perimeter. You can see there's a couple of measure subs here, and this wheel keeps popping up. Like I'm still getting, I'm using my Wacom exclusively now instead of the mouse, because I'm having some RSI in my right arm, so that's why I'm exclusively using the Wacom now. So if sometimes these wheel pops up, it's because I'm still getting a little bit used to it, because it has like a bunch of buttons here. Of course, it sometimes accidentally might press. So anyway, you can see here, this will measure this stuff, and this is all going to be put on this on these primitives. So there's attributes, so stiffness, so how stiff is it, and there's a type. There's a distance constraint, and you have a bend constraint. Essentially, the distance constraint is like how much can it sort of stretch out, and the other one is essentially the angle. So if, oh wait, I'm looking at the wrong solver, right? Should look at that one, different one for my example. Right, so if I press play, so the distance constraint is essentially gonna say, right, how should these, like how much can sort of these things stretch out? So if this distance constraint would be, so you can change all of these parameters in here. You can see stretch, and you have bend stiffness. So let's say I just make it like really low, then it would be very stretchy, as you can see. And if I make it very high, it would be almost not stretchy, and I can go everything sort of in between. So essentially, like, do you want a stretchy rubber, or do you want something else? You can play around with this. But essentially, that's what That's what this thing here is going to be doing. That's the stretch stiffness. Now there's also the bend stiffness. Essentially, that's gonna be like, all right, we have this stuff going on here. So you can see, and like here, the angle is gonna change. So you can have a look at the normals. You can see there's a straight angle here from the normal to sort of like how these primitives are oriented. So there's a straight angle. If this moves down, see the angle changes. That's kind of what this bend stiffness is. Like if this is very stiff, it's gonna say, all right, the stiffness in sort of how much this can bend should be really high. That's kind of the difference between these bend constraints and these distance constraints. One is sort of determining stretchiness, and the other one is determining the bend. So there's also some attributes, like I mentioned, that live on the points. For example, the drag. So here you have the drag. So if I increase the drag here to 1000, you can see it's going to really have a lot of drag. And same with tangent drag. Let's make this a little bit. Right. So you can see there's more drag now with the way this bends. So you can see there's a lot of drag in sort of the way it folds in. Well, if I put it like this, you can see it just immediately falls down. While with this one, it's really going to be sort of the drag of just how does it sort of fall, kind of like wind resistance in that way. We're going to be using this a lot when we're going to be dealing with, because we're going to be in a later video, we're going to like emit some stuff into a Vellum simulation, like make some falling leaves and stuff like that. This is really going to be important once we start doing something like that. So yeah, there's these different types of constraints, and again, there's these presets that sort of add more constraints together. You can set these up yourself with these Vellum constraints here. And again, we're gonna get into a lot of this in this video, but some more in later videos once we actually start building some custom stuff. So before we dive into the other constraints, right now we've been using this Vellum solver, which essentially, like I mentioned, it's a SOP level solver, which means it's easy to use. You can just drag these constraints and geometry in there, and it will solve it. You have a whole bunch of controls on here. You can click, and then you have options here to manipulate it. Oftentimes, there's going to be reason why you don't want to use this. You can actually build a solver yourself in DOPS. Well, you're not building the solver yourself, but you're configuring the way it's set up yourself in a DOP network. And this is actually also how this is working. So if you right click on this and go allow editing of content, you can see there's also a bunch of nodes in here. And then there's a DOP network in here. You can see it's a DOP network similar to the rigid body one that I built earlier. And you can see there's a Vellum solver here, Vellum object, and some sources. You can actually do this yourself, and that's how I generally like to use Vellum. But just let me show you sort of how you can set something like this up in yourself before we sort of continue with the different constraint types. So you kind of already like that you're already familiar with how that works. So let me just delete the DOP network here. So let's make a DOP network. So DOP stands for dynamic operators, similar to SOP stands for service operators. So you can just go in here and you can put nodes down. What I want to do is I want to put the geo in the first input, constraints in the second input, similar to how we have it in this Vellum solver here. And then let's put this sphere in the third input for the collisions. Then go in here and let's make a Vellum solver. Let's put it down, do a Vellum object, and let's do a Vellum source. So you might notice this Vellum object also has a initial geometry, initial constraints. So you can actually from there, you can also load in your sort of your constraints and geometry like that. So there's multiple ways to do this. Let's just open up this extra view that we made, because we made it for a reason, might as well use it, and you can actually see why it's useful. So if you go in here, you can see then we can still sort of stay in here because we have this pin to 1. We can actually sort of work in this separately. So you can drag stuff in here. So we can here drag geo, drag constraints. And we can make a gravity. And then it would fall down. Let's pin this to first input. Right, it's interesting. Actually, this seems to override it in this case. That's interesting. That's a bug. Should not do this. All right, let me just remove this from here. It should not. This should not happen. Interesting. It's actually right. So what we can do in here in this Vellum source, we can drag these things in here, constraint path, and then you can see it fall down. It's interesting to see. I'm playing around with it. Kind of wondering why this is happening. Now it's sourcing it twice. If I do it like this, that's interesting because this actually should work. So seems to be a bug. Should probably report this. Yeah. Anyway, there's two ways you can sort. So your initial geometry in those would be your geometry. Sort of that's coming in and would work. I almost never use this. What I generally do is I use these Vellum source. Essentially, this will source your geometry. Like you see it here, you put the geometry and constraints in here, and this will source it. It also means you can, for example, have multiple sources. So you could grab another source, and then plug it in, and then it would source it twice. In this case, they're overlapping, so it's not really doing anything. But that's how I like to do it. And kind of the way that you should see how this is working is that this brings in geometry. So sourcing it, it's going to be putting it into the solver. The solver is going to process it. It's going to be blah, 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 right? Doing its thing, doing its solving. And then it's going to output the result in this Vellum object. And then if we check to our second input here, in this object merge here, we can load in this Vellum object. And this will essentially just grab the data that's in this Vellum object and will sort of load it back in. And that's kind of what this Vellum solver is doing. So what we've been doing now is we've been dragging this in. There's actually an expression that you can type to sort of pick these automatically. What you do is you do backtick op input path. So it's going to say operator input path. We want it to, so you do it like that. So we want to go up a level. Then from the 0th input, which is going to be first input, you can see it appear there. Then for the constraints, we do that where we do the first input. And you can see we actually get exactly the same thing. Now we want to do a static object to do some collisions. And we can actually paste that in there, third input, and then we should have it in there, as you can see. There we go. So with this gravity, there's different types of forces in Houdini. You can either use an actual force. So this is treated as a regular force, or you can use so this works both on volumes and on points. You can also use a pop force, which is essentially works on the points of something. And if I type minus 9.8 for gravity here, you can see it's going to do exactly the same thing. Or I can do something else. I can just get a little bit of noise going and just have it move around. You can see you can get a nice piece of cloth moving around. So there's multiple ways you can sort of add stuff like this. We're gonna get more into this later, of course. But yeah, that's the way that you set something like this up. And like for any of our more complex examples that we're going to be doing later, we're probably just going to mostly be using using the DOP network. But for now, for our examples, we're just going to be using Vellum Solver on sub level. By the way, with these pop forces, actually, if you go in here, you can actually put pop forces in here as well. Plug it into force. And then let's turn off gravity. You can see we got something similar going on. And the way that's working is like if we go in here again, we can open it up. We can go into the DOP network here. You can see actually this is just also being plugged into particle forces. There's a subnetwork here, and that is the node network that we just put our forces in. All right, match current definition. All right, so now it's locked again. All right, so let's have a look at some of these other constraints, because we've been talking a little bit about these distance constraints and bend constraints. And with cloth, it's pretty straightforward. But there are some other examples where it's going to be a little bit more interesting. Let's talk about that. All right, so here we have an example of a vellum balloon. Let me just reconfigure it so you kind of see what's going on. So vellum balloon. Let's attach it to the sphere. So it's the one that we made before. And let's plug it in here and plug it in here. And let's have a look at the constraints. So if I highlight this null here, and again, viewport bug, great, I love it. All right, scene view. All right, there we go. So here we have the constraints. Let's do a null for the geometry. We can have a look at this stuff. You can see a lot of the other stuff is very similar. The main difference here is the volume. So it's essentially going to contain sort of the volume of this object per point. So it's sort of measuring the volume of this thing, because we're talking about a balloon, of course. So we need to know the volume. And you can see this actually, this balloon is two constraints combined. So we have a cloth constraint and a pressure constraint. Let me, if I disable the pressure constraint, you see it's going to be the same as it was for cloth. There's not really anything different here. But if I enable this thing, this will actually create new constraints called pressure constraints. And so we can go here through here. You can see there's one called pressure. There's only one. And if we want to have a look at this, because just looking at this, it's a little bit confusing. We can actually go in here. We can actually show these individual constraints. So let's go pressure, delete non-selected. So you can see here's our pressure constraint. This is actually it's a primitive that's sort of just goes all around our entire object. If we do this on another piece of geometry, like a test geometry here, it would be the same. It would just be for every piece of connected geometry, it would have just a primitive that's sort of going all the way around to sort of encapsulate sort of the entire length of this thing. And let me get the delete back. Right. So the reason why this is important is because this has a rest length. So again, this is the length of this entire thing, and there's a rest length orig. So the original rest length. Now let's say this balloon inflates. That means the way that it knows that it's going to be inflating is that this thing containing the rest length. So the rest length is going to inflate. So it's going to be twice as big. It's going to be twice the same size. I can try this when here let's do a rest length scale 2. You can see rest length here is now, because I'm doing it here on the constraints instead of on the solver, it's going to increase both the rest length and the rest length origin, because it's just going to override it from the get-go. If I were to do this in the solver, right, I keep having these problems sometimes with the wake up. It's going to go all over the place. But if we're going to inflate, for example, this inside of the solver, it's going to inflate it, and we're going to it's going to be inflated from the original rest length. There's going to be examples that we're going to be doing later where you're going to be seeing this. But so this thing is going to contain sort of the information on how much is this thing inflated. If I want to, I can actually show this. If I go in here in the Vellum solver, and I can put a Vellum constraints, plug it in. So it takes the original geometry and let's do, no, not Vellum constraints, constraint properties, sorry. Constraint properties. So this will allow me the overrides of the properties on these constraints. I can put this on the, I need to make a group for my pressure constraint because these are not automatically properly grouped. Well, they are grouped because I could remove them, but it's a wrong group type. See, it's go. So it's only going to keep these groups here. So I need to put it into an actual proper group. So I can do that in here and call this pressure. All right, so now we can actually find it in here. Pressure constraint. Let's say I do rest length and rest length scale. So let's say I put rest length scale to 2 and I press play. You can see it will immediately inflate. And if I have a look at the constraints on this thing going out, we should be able to, let's just hide all of our attributes and do check rest length. There we go. And then rest length origin. All right, so you can see the rest length is double the rest length origin because we increased it there. So it knows the original rest length, like how big was it before it sort of inflated. And so that's why essentially we have this curve sort of going all the way through our balloon. So that's the constraint that's essentially gonna know how much is this inflated, how much is this deflated. And that's what Vellum does in general. It just makes these constraints. Show all attributes. So it just makes these constraints that have different groups, and then they all hold their individual information. And then Vellum, because it knows sort of what type of constraint it is, it's going to sort of know what to do with it. And like so we have these, and Vellum, because we have these point count, like we have the point count of this geometry, we have the point count on our constraints. And again, it keeps, like, it's been a long time that I've had this many viewport issues. I think it maybe has to do with, maybe because I have PowerPoint open. I don't know. Normally I don't have PowerPoint open. This pressure constraint just keeps the pressure of the object. It contains the pressure, nothing else. And the pressure is just going to be the one primitive. Again, that's the, that's this thing. It's just gonna contain the pressure. How much pressure is on there? The pressure is gonna push on the geometry and on the other constraints. And again, these other constraints are these cloth constraints, which again have a stretchiness and have a bendiness. So this pressure is gonna push on those, and then depending on how stretchy or bendy these are, this is gonna sort of inflate outwards. So one thing, for example, that I could do, let's say I do make this polygon. Let's say I paint on this, paint attributes, paint the mask, right? Right. So let's say I paint on this. All right. Let's fill this first. All right. Let's just say I just paint over this entire thing. It's gonna. Right. So it's going to have a little bit different things going on here. This is written out as a mask. And then, for example, I could go in here in the stretch stiffness, get scale by attribute, again, say stretch by mask. And now this pressure is going to sort of push on these constraints. And then we should see that it's going to stretch more in some places. Right, you can see here, it's a little bit crazy on the parts where it's a little bit, where it's blue, because there's going to be 0, so it should not be 0. Right. See, it's a little bit, maybe a little bit extreme still. Let's do, right. All right, but you can see, you can sort of, you can kind of see what's going on. So you would say, right, how stretchy are you on the cloth? And then the pressure, you cannot really put anything on there because the pressure is just going to contain how much pressure is going to build up in this thing. Right. Let's have a look at some other stuff. Let's talk soft bodies. Right, so let's talk a little bit about soft bodies, and they come in 2 different flavors. You have, if we just make a sphere here. make it a polygon sphere. Right. If you do Vellum soft body, there's a Strut soft body and there's a Tetrahedral soft body. And let's first talk about the Strut soft body. So if you connect this, again, it's just going to first make cloth constraints, which is, again, it's just the general cloth constraints that we had before. You can see they look a little bit different here because we're dealing with a triangular mesh, but same stuff. And then we're dealing with struts. So let's have a look at these struts. Let's make a delete. And let's do struts, delete unselected. All right, so you can see here we have struts. And you can see they are essentially their lines sort of going across our soft body. The way you can kind of imagine this is if you have a springy mattress, right? And you lay on it and the springs are gonna sort of push in. Now, how soft or hard your mattress is going to depend on how firm are these springs. And essentially, you can imagine these are springs. So these all have individually they have data on it. You can see they have a rest length, they have a stiffness, damping ratio. So these individual, and you can drive these individually as well. But they have a springiness to it. So you can imagine that if I make one of these more firm, then it's gonna push more on these pieces, like these cloth constraints that we have above. So this is gonna be more firm and it's gonna push on it. So our sphere is gonna sort of stay in shape. Well, if I make them very soft and like easy to sort of, so I make them very soft springs, they're gonna sort of fold in when pressure comes on it, and then becomes a very soft body. So let's have a look at this. I have one set up over here. So again, it's the similar thing that we have here. And let's just press play. You can see it sort of drops down. Boop. You can see it sort of gets a little bit springy down there. And I guess we can hold this, press Alt. We can sort of copy that. Let's maybe move our sphere over. And we can actually merge different things in together. So if we just merge geo in together like this, we can connect geometry there. And then we can, it keeps opening the fucking wheel. All right. And I do the constraints. There we go. All right. So now we can have a look at two different ones together. So now they're the same. But if we change these struts here, you can see here, and there's multiple options. We're gonna go into this more later, but so you can see the stretchy stiffness. Let's say I make the one very soft. You see this one is it's not really pushing on it a lot, right? So these are very soft constraints. Well, this other one has, like, the constraints are quite hard, so it's very rigid. You can see even here it's getting a little bit of a weird shape here because, like, these ones are sort of pointing straight up and they're pushing straight up on the cloth. I guess if you wanted to sort of change that, you'd also need to make the probably bend stiffness a little bit higher. Would probably still do it, but yeah, you can see sort of how you can change this stuff on the struts and on the there you go. Now this one is very bouncy. So yeah, that's a strut. That's a strut soft body. The way that these struts are created, like you also have control. It's not gonna do much on a sphere here, but if I check these struts, non-selected, like I can say, right, the maximum length that these struts can have. Again, that's not really gonna do much on our sphere, but let's say we do a different object. We put that in. So these has some thinner parts, and I guess if we change the max strut length here to something very low, you can see only these tiny parts are gonna get struts created. You can see we can say, all right, well, how do we want to create these things? Bunch of controls that you have here. Again, this is just an overview of the constraint. We're going to dive more in depth for any of these things in later videos when we start doing more advanced things. But yeah, that's just a sort of a basic understanding of those. So those are struts of bodies. They're very fast to solve, but you can already see like there's some weird stuff going on. Like I mentioned before, we have, let's put this one back in. Let's make the other one a little bit stiffer again. Yeah, like weird stuff like this, where like one of these constraints is pointing upwards, and it's like getting a little bit stiffer, and the other ones are sort of angled, so they're gonna fall in a little bit more. So yeah, so you have these weird stuff going on there that you might not have with the other type of soft body that there is. So this is a tetrahedral soft body, and essentially what that does, it's right. What it does. Let's just configure one ourselves first, and let's do a sphere. Let's do soft body, tetrahedral soft body. So what this will do is it will create a tet conform. This creates tetrahedrons. If I middle mouse on this, you can see tetrahedrons are actually a specific primitive type, because you can see they're not there. And here we have tetrahedrons, which are it's a mathematical type thing. It's essentially it's a triangular type shape, and Houdini can use these to do all kinds of different things. And if I put a delete in here, and if I put a delete, and it's easier to see what's going on. Right. So you can see this will actually create an inner structure. So it creates these tetrahedrons that are sort of building up this mesh. So it actually creates an inner structure. And you can see here there's only one constraint here, and this is going to go over the tetrahedral stretch, which sets up these individual tetrahedrons. And essentially for these tetrahedrons, by the way, if we look at these constraints, you see actually there's no lines here, whatever, because these are actually just the tetrahedrons that it's going to run on. Again, they're a separate primitive type. And essentially for each of these ones, it's going to say, all right, each of these tetrahedrons, which is kind of just like it's a little triangle, is going to say, all right, how stretchy are you? And the benefit to this is because this now has an inner structure, and this inner structure is much more accurate. So we can have a look at here. I already have it set up. It's also a lot slower because it has, like this one is sort of do an estimation, and the other and like a tetrahedral soft, but you can already see is like quite springy. This one actually has this inner structure of this, like this entire inner structure that's going to sort of like inside of it. It's also going to do like you can imagine if you're going to have like if you're gonna do a character that's like has like muscles, like it might make sense to have to actually be sort of to actually have this inner structure. Or another probably a better example, like let's say you have a soft body that's gonna break apart. Might make more sense to have these individual tetrahedrons actually be able to sort of break up. There's actually a node for that called that fracture, which we're gonna go more into this stuff later once we actually get to it. Maybe we can do like a video later over like putting a zombie in a grinder or something. Yeah, if you want to see that, then let me know. Like we can do a tet fracture, for example. You can see it's gonna make individual parts of these individual tetrahedrons. And again, if we throw this into a simulation, and this seems to, it's going to constrain these together, which we don't want. And let me just check this. Is this doing connectivity? Right, we should probably do connectivity on this. Getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but right, connectivity on the primitives. Split. Oh, yeah, split primitives. All right. Just have to turn on split on the fracture. Right now you can see we get these individual pieces. Now if we go to solver, you see this is going to fall apart. And you can constrain these together, so they're going to stick together first, and then going to do all kinds of other things. And like if we change the tetrahedral scale, I should do it here. So it's going to create more tetrahedrons. It's going to get a lot slower really quickly. Oh, by the way, one thing, like if you didn't know, depending on the graphics card, so Vellum runs on the graphics card by default. You can check if you go to preferences, go to miscellaneous. You can see, all right, CPU or GPU. So that's the OpenCL device. Vellum runs on OpenCL. You can if you have multiple graphics cards, you can say, right, which one should it run on? Or you can say if you have a very heavy simulation and it's going to run out of your VRAM on your card. Let's say you have a pretty bad GPU with not a lot of RAM. You can actually put it to CPU as well, and then it can run on your CPU. Just something, and you need to reboot Houdini, by the way, for that to take effect. Just something that you're aware of. So again, let's remove this tetrahedral. But yeah, so this thing actually has a sort of an internal structure that's going to be a lot more accurate. Also, if I let's say I merge something in here. Say I do a merge, I do a box here. All right. Let's say I'm gonna animate this down. Right. There we go. All right. I can probably squeeze it a little bit more, but this is going to behave much more accurately, like you can already see, than the Strut soft body. Like I'll show you the difference on the Strut soft body. You can see this is relatively stable. One thing to keep in mind with tetrahedral soft bodies. Let's have a look at this. The thing that comes out of here. Let's increase the frequency a little bit. The thing that comes out of here are still tetrahedrals, and you don't want to render those. What you generally do is you take your original geometry and you let me show you. So you have a thing called the Vellum post process, which essentially has options like for example, subdivide, or smooth your geometry. Let's say we have one here, Strut soft body. Let's say we have a very low resolution one, and let's say, right, we want to subdivide this a little bit after simulation. So like, for example, we could say, right, subdivide it a little bit, to detangle, do whatever, like extrude by thickness, etc., etc. These are tetrahedrons. This doesn't work. Like you cannot subdivide them. They're not regular geometry. What you generally do with tetrahedrons like this is that you do like a point deform. So you take your original piece of geometry and you deform it by the animated piece of geometry. So, and then again, you can just do whatever you want. Now it's just regular geometry again. We can subdivide it, do whatever we want. It has all of the attributes, has everything on there. So a lot of times that's what you would do. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves for this the introductory chapter. There's a couple more constraints. For example, shape match constraint is one that tries to keep its original shape, no matter the cost. It kind of gets a little bit like a rigid body object. You can see here, even though like it's still Vellum. So if something really pushes on it, it's still going to deform a little bit, but it's going to roughly behave like a rigid body object. But similar in Bullet, if stuff really pushes on top of each other, it's going to penetrate. Same here. So like it's like with this thing, it's just getting in the way. But shape match constraint is essentially just going to try to keep the original thing as intact as possible. And I guess if you really wanted to have this behave like more like a rigid body, you could do this after the simulations. You could Just say right back this thing and then do like a point deform. Time shift. Right, and now it's actually behaving like a rigid body. That's what I did in my Sassy Snacks, the second one with the ice cubes. As you can see now, we do get sort of a rigid body type behavior. So that's another one. And there's also one more thing that I briefly wanted to discuss in this introductory video before we sort of round this up for this week. There's already been a lot of information. But there's also you can do grains in Vellum and you can do fluids. And it's kind of based on the same concept. So essentially you create points from an object like this. These points have, if we just have a look at this, and this is also the interesting thing here, is that the constraints don't really, like there's not really constraints here. So it's just only going off the information that's on the points. So they have a p-scale, is grain is turned on. If this was a fluid, it would not have is grain. As you can see, it would just be treated as fluid. So if it has is grain turned on, it will be treated as grain, else it's going to be treated as fluid. Essentially, this is just going to say, all right, these points, they cannot move through each other. So kind of like a point relax. So if you don't know point relax, let me try let's do VDB from polygons. For VDB, scatter a bunch of points in there. Let's turn relax off. You can see here's these points. Let's do let's say I add sphere GL. What's it called again? One, right? You can see that, and then we're gonna say, all right, let's say I add p-scale equals. Let's define the p-scale. You don't have to repeat this after. Oh, that's sorry. You don't have to repeat this after me. It's just to show you what essentially what it's doing. If you want to know how to build a custom particle solver, like for grains and stuff like that, by the way, I have a course called Custom Solvers in Houdini, which allows you to actually build a particle, grain, etc. solver yourself, like completely from scratch, like in a SOP solver. I'll put it in the description. But let's have a look at point relax. And here we have, for example, point relax 3D. If I say relax in 3D space, it's going to be slow. But you can see this is going to push them out based on the p-scale so they don't overlap. So you can see they go from overlapping to not overlapping. Well, somewhat not overlapping depending on the iterations and stuff like that. And you can see it's this is quite slow, but if we crank the iterations high enough, it's gonna relax. And of course, stuff like that is a lot faster in Vellum because it runs on OpenCL on the GPU. Essentially, just what this thing does is just, let me disable this, is it will just, if I have a look at the simulation, it will just be grain. You can see them falling apart. They're kind of sticking together here. That's because I have attraction weight turned on. So attraction weight, so you see if I just do it like this, they will just fall down like sand. Attraction weight sort of has them sort of stick together. You can see you kind of get a soft body. So you can do soft bodies like this if you use this to for example deform your geometry if you want. So there's another way to use it. Yeah, this attraction weight sort of keeps them together. Now they're stacked up, and you can actually use this. You can use attributes on this as well. So let's say I put cluster points to get some nice clusters. And then we're gonna sort of say that the attraction weight should be the cluster. So we get like a lot more weight on some than on others. And then we get something like this, where some are not attracted at all, and some are really sticking together. And again, you can mix and match. You can put attributes on it. You can do a whole bunch of cool stuff. And this is similar with fluid. Like if I turn this to is fluid, it's going to behave as a fluid. This is going to look weird now with the attraction weight. But we'll get to that once we get to it. So yeah, that's kind of an introductory to Vellum and to like all of the different constraint types, how these constraints work. I kind of hope that it makes sense. Like I tried my best to break it down as easy as possible, and I kind of hope that you now understand like how these different types of constraints work, and sort of like how they interact, how you can manipulate this data. I know it's still very brief and we haven't made anything super interesting, but this will be a very good primer to all of the other stuff that we're going to be doing. So let me know what you want to see next week. What I think I'm going to be doing next week is cover soft bodies a little bit more in depth. And I think I'm going to sort of redo the scene called Vellum Booty Shake that I have a tutorial on, which is essentially a fat lady dancing using soft bodies. And I want to sort of expand on that a little bit more with sort of new things that have made their way into Houdini, because I've got some questions about that from people, and I kind of figured that might make for an interesting thing next week. But if you want to see something else, also let me know. I'm going to be like if you have questions, just let me know. I'll try to cover as much as I can. And again, I'm going to try to do this a weekly, make this a weekly thing where I'm going to record one every week and sort of try to make this an interesting series. So hopefully this was interesting. All these source files, like today, I know today's source file is probably not the most interesting, but it's going to be on Patreon and on Gumroad. So you can get it there. I'm not sure how I'm doing the Gumroad thing yet, if I'm going to sort of selling it per week or if I'm going to put it like in a package that's going to like increase in it's gonna get more expensive every week, but you'll be able to get them in the description, and they're all gonna be on Patreons. If you're a Patreon supporter, you can just download it there. So yeah, hopefully this was interesting. Leave this a thumbs up if you liked it. Leave this a thumbs down if you didn't like it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. And again, like I'm really gonna try to do this weekly, so there should be more content. I know I've been promising that more often, but this will make it easier. Like doing these weekly videos, like based on comments that I get, is going to make it a lot easier for me to actually do content, because pre-preparing large courses is just a lot more work and hard to do in between other stuff. So yeah, hopefully you liked it, and see you in the next one. Peace.